This upcoming roundtable on multilingualism in an international school setting will focus on a number of key areas within language, literacy, and foreign language acquisition in an international school environment. We'll be discussing the importance of language learning at school, strategies for effective language acquisition, the transferable skills that it gives students that are applicable to all other subjects, and the importance of representation and bringing in the local culture into the language classroom in an international school environment. The discussion will focus on actionable, practical strategies and initiatives that the listener can think about implementing into their own classroom. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by our guests today. And if we can go through maybe a quick introduction of each of you, that would be fantastic. Sarah, you're at the top of the screen for me. So yeah, would you mind just introducing yourself?
Yeah, I can start. Yeah. So I'm Sarah Forbes. I'm the product manager at DK Learning, specifically responsible for English for Everyone, which is our ELT course. Before I started working in publishing 10 years ago, I was an ELT teacher at many private language schools around the world, specifically in Europe and Asia.
Fantastic, thanks, Sarah. Adam, you're just below Sarah on my list here, so yeah, do you want to go next?
Great. Thanks, Max. My name is Adam Beeson. I'm based in Costa Rica at Pan American School. Pan American School is an IB Continuum school. It was the first IB Continuum school in the country. I teach English, language, and literature in the diploma program and in the middle years program. I've also taught language acquisition in the middle years program. And then I'm also the coordinator of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging across the whole school.
Excellent. Thanks, Adam. Jacob, you're next on my screen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jacob, and I'm based in Suzhou in China, where I've been for around 10 years. And I'm currently head of multilingual learning at the school here. And I'm also teach English language acquisition, including in the IB diploma program.
Brilliant. Francois, what about yourself?
Hello everyone, my name is Francois Stalder and I am based in Budapest at the American International School of Budapest. I've been here this is my 5th year, and I teach, I'm a world language teacher. I teach French, Spanish and German in all sections of the schools, actually in the elementary, middle and high school. And I just want to point out that before I came to AISB, I was in Bangalore, where Himani is from. So this is very interesting.
Excellent. And Himani, what about yourself?
Hello, my name is Himani, and I was born and raised in Bangalore, currently based in Budapest and working as an MYP Individuals and Societies teacher, as well as a DP Environmental Systems and Societies teacher, lots of systems, at the Budapest British International School.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Delighted to be joined by all you guys. Right, so moving straight into my first question for us to discuss. Why is the topic of multilingualism so important in an international school setting? So quite a broad question to start with. Who'd like to dive in and tackle that first?
I don't mind going first.
Go for it, Francois.
Right. Because, you know, multilingualism in international schools is almost redundant, right? All international schools believe that multilingualism is very important. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an international school, right? The concept of multilingualism and multicultural education, it lies within international education. And so we can't really have internationalism without having multiple languages spoken and taught in our schools. So that's very important to me. Now, from a world language perspective, I think, in my opinion, it's also important to see that students are not only proficient in English, but also in their own language, but also in the language they acquire from scratch, perhaps. Because that shows their ability to adapt to new concepts, to new contexts, because those are often students who travel a lot, who move from one school to another. And so the ability to adapt to those different contexts is super important, in my opinion. And also, thirdly, learning another language from scratch and taking it to a good level of proficiency is hard. It's hard work. And so it requires hard work and perseverance. And students who can do that have something above other students, a sort of value added, which later on employers can easily recognize. So that's why, in my opinion, multilingualism is super important in our international schools.
Anyone else want to dive in? Yeah, Himani, go for it.
Thank you. I can add on just to say that language is it's a vehicle, it's a carrier of culture as well. So to be proficient in one's own native language, for example, is to understand how your way of knowing has shaped your perspective of the world, right? And how that changes across different languages, how they literally shape the way we think. And as Francois said, even, acquainting yourself with the language of a country you're going to live with for a year is a valuable lesson, because it's giving you some kind of insight behind the behaviors and traditions of the culture you're surrounded by. So I think it's also fostering an ethos of pluralism and respect.
Yeah, I was going to say the exact same thing about respect, actually. I think it's knowing that there's space for you in the school, by respecting different home languages, but also respecting maybe the local language as well of the school that you're in, which might not be your own. So you're really making that effort to, as you say, understand the culture and kind of integrate in that way, because I think we can all agree, can't we, that kind of having cultural insights just helps understanding, doesn't it? It makes, that kind of mutual respect kind of grow between students and peers as well within the classroom setting, making it much easier for the teacher as well.
Yeah, 100%. Jacob, Adam, what about yourself? What are your thoughts?
I think that I totally agree that multilingualism should be central to these things we talk about when we talk about the aims of international education, be that intercultural understanding, international mindedness, global citizenship. We can't do those things in a meaningful way if we don't also engage with multilingualism, languages and culture. But I would, just to add a little bit of a critical perspective, I think that many international schools, they don't have systems set up to properly leverage this resource of the linguistic diversity within the school communities. So I think it's definitely true that it's a fact that our schools are linguistically and culturally diverse, but what are the schools doing to leverage that, to ensure there's equity within these diverse ecosystems of our schools? So I like in the IB documentation, you see this linguistic that multilingualism is a fact, a right, and a resource. And I think we can, for the first one is obvious that our communities are linguistically and culturally diverse, but we also need to consider this as a resource for learning, and how are teachers and how are our systems and curriculum tapping into that resource and leveraging that resource in an equitable way. And also in terms of equity and as well, and justice, etc., we're thinking about the right to being multilingual. And UNESCO, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, saying that every child has the right to maintain and develop their home language, the language and culture of their family, their background, as well as the language of the school, as well as the language of the place where they are currently living. So once we consider it through the lens of rights and resources, as well as it being a fact, then I think that really emphasizes the importance of multilingualism and engaging deeply with multilingualism in our school communities.
Excellent point.
Yeah, thanks, Jake, for saying that. I would just build on that a little bit. I'm fascinated by the history of international schools and international education, and while multilingualism is one of these key defining characteristics that make international schools unique, I think we've seen also a long history of the same international schools having policies and practices that are essentially enforcing linguistic imperialism. If you're multilingual, we welcome you. All right. So I was saying that the practices, the policies were built around this idea of linguistic imperialism, with English only signs in the hallway, with social hierarchies built around English language skills, with home language kind of not encouraged, right? Luckily we're at a time where that's shifting, where it's, you know, it's more at least common policy that home language is encouraged, translanguaging is encouraged. But I think there is this lag behind policy and practice, and we still have this sort of leftover monolingual mindset in our international schools. And I think that's why multilingualism as a concept is so important, because so many educators and schools are on this journey of shifting away from that history. And I think that's why this panel is important, to come away with practical tips of how we can encourage and embrace multilingualism in international schools.
Just jump back in there quickly to kind of add, you just second that, really, like what do we mean by multilingualism when we ask that question of, you know, why is multilingualism important? Because there has been, you know, within international schooling historically, as Adam's saying, there's been this emphasis on improving people, giving them snatches of little bits of languages, you know, learning new languages, which is all really important. But then the home language development and maintenance has been forgotten and neglected, as Adam's saying. So let's broaden our understanding of multilingualism. If we take that multilingual turn, it has wide implications for international schools and all areas of international schooling.
I agree with what Jacob is saying. It's an awareness process. It's not just about learning another language. It's about also, I think Himani said, you know, being sensitive or respectful to the local culture and to other cultures. It's an awareness process. It's multilingualism is something that we have in our schools to make our students more sensitive to other people and their background. And so it is another reason, really, why it is so important. And we need to really highlight this fact.
So it really does go a long way to sort of help students build those other sort of human skills, right? It's a much bigger thing than just learning a language and being able to communicate in another language. There's many more facets to it, right? Yeah. Fantastic. Any other thoughts on that before we move on to the next question from anyone? Okay, great. All right, fantastic. So sort of considering now, you know, looking at language learning a little bit more depth now, sort of learning languages at an early age. You know, how can learning another language help across potentially other subjects in the curriculum? I know we touched on a couple of things in that last point, but it'd be great to hear your guys' thoughts on, yeah, what are these transferable skills that learning a language at a young age can help across all different subjects in the curriculum? Who'd like to get
I think it's kind of,
yeah.
I'll go first because I've probably got a bit less to say than the people currently teaching, but I think I always thought it really helped with kind of those transferable skills of like problem solving, critical thinking, kind of as well, when sometimes in ELT as well, we'd do like mediation of text, so a text in another language, and they were trying to convey the meaning to somebody in English, but it's not about translation. It's kind of that kind of cultural meaning and things like that as well. So I think is going to be so useful for when you're in the real world as an adult as well, and those kind of skills that can really carry you very far. I think just things with memory, concentration, I think it's all quite proven, isn't it, that being kind of speaking kind of several languages helps with these skills.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Mani, what about yourself?
Yeah, I think just coming back to Adam's point, connecting back to Adam's point about linguistic imperialism, there is this sense of you take for granted this fact that, okay, our students are bilingual, but are you actually actively working on developing that bilingualism? How authentic is that bilingualism? What I noticed with many of my students in India was that when they spoke in their home languages, the tone shifted. They spoke mostly at the level of a fifth grader. They could speak mostly informally. Tone was mainly sort of the kind of tone they'd use with their domestic help. And I was like, hold on, you do not know how to actually engage in academic discourse in your native language. And that's important because if we want to, say, look at the bulk of literature and academia today, it's in Western European languages. If we want to widen that base, we need to ensure that our students are proficient in their home languages, because if they go on to specialize in other disciplines, they can contribute to that field further. So yeah, I think it's important to recognize that bilingualism isn't just, oh, I can speak 2 languages, but actually to what extent can you speak those 2 languages, and how are schools fostering that? So actually being able to learn this academic jargon, actually learning subject-specific terminology in their home languages would be very valuable, and to see if there is even an equivalent within their language, and then to question why if there isn't. Yeah.
And Himani, just to get a quick question on that. So what was the reason you think that you mentioned the students when you were teaching in India struggled to sort of communicate in their home language? Why was that? It was because English was such a dominant language outside of the classroom as well, or why was that?
Yeah, I think with the case in India, it's difficult because we don't have, like, English is our unifying language. It isn't even Hindi. So yes, students talk in English a lot more, but also it's something parents push, as in, in international schools as well, the second language option isn't ever, oh, Kannada, Telugu. It's always French, German, Spanish, languages of the corporate world, essentially, right? So you see the sense of like, I don't want to talk in my native language. And the only time you're talking in your native language is when you're talking to domestic help, or people who really cannot speak Hindi, English. You talk with your parents, with your family in English as well. Yeah.
Great. Any other thoughts on why language learning is so important at an early age and those transferable skills?
To pick up on Himani's point, that the more language you know, the more you can do in your different languages, the better you'll be able to learn in the various subjects that you're studying. So that's the vital importance of developing the students' like complete linguistic repertoire, expanding that repertoire, and ensuring that we are transferring the language skills between the languages as well, so that where students are able to form arguments and write academic texts in their various languages. And also I think it's about the responsibility of all teachers for language development, not just the language teachers. And we often hear the catchphrase that every teacher is also a teacher of English, or also a teacher of language. And like most catchphrases, I think that's overly simplistic. I would rather say something like language is fundamental to making meaning, language is fundamental to learning. Therefore, you can't be a science teacher without also teaching the way that scientists use language. So it's kind of fundamental to the teaching of the subjects. It's not an optional thing that subject teachers can just do if they have a bit of time. Teach them a little bit of English as well as the science. What we're doing when we're teaching a subject is teaching the disciplinary literacy of that subject. So I think reframing it in that way helps to see why language learning is fundamental to all learning.
Yeah, if I can add on to what has already been said about the value of that students attach to language, their language, like Himani said about their native language. In some cases, students and people don't attach as much value to their native language as they should, because every language has value, as much value as another language, whether they are dominant languages or not. And as you see that in India with the local languages, you would also see that in, for example, Spanish in the US, where people migrate and they want to learn the dominant language, English, and their parents would tell them, no, don't speak Spanish, because we want you to be able to communicate in the dominant language, which is English. and the language of the country we come from. We are migrants, and we should not speak that language in front of others. And that's wrong. And that, of course, comes with the background of the student, the person, the family, where they come from. And it's sad that, that some people think that their language has less value than another dominant language. And so we need to teach our students that language, including their own language, is very important, and not just the dominant language. Now, the first part of your question, Max, was about the importance of teaching languages at an early age. And in my school, we're just about to introduce the teaching of languages. That we've got 3 foreign languages. So I'm a world language teacher. So we've got French, German, and Spanish, and we're going to introduce those languages earlier. So far, we start in grade 4. We're going to go down from next year onwards to lower grades. And as well as Hungarian is another language that we want to teach because it's the local language. Again, the importance of teaching the local language is very important. And that made me think of just an anecdote here. When I was in Asia, I met someone who's from Penang. He was the principal of a school, and he was an avid, keen linguist. And he would ask his CAS students, CAS creativity, activity, and social, I think it's an IB program. He would ask his CAS students to engage in a project where the students had to teach their native language to young learners, very young learners. And the idea was that he recognized that those are the years when students are young, when they're young, those are the years when students form their language and develop their ability to learn other languages, including the sounds. There are sounds that as adults we can't pronounce that young children can pronounce. And so the more languages we can teach at an early age, the better it is for the students, because they will be able to utter those sounds later on in life, because they would be used to them. So starting multiple languages at an early age really trains the brain and those organs within the mouth to develop those skills that will shape them for future learning. I just wanted to say that.
No, just very, very quickly, I agree with everything that's been said. I'll just talk from a very practical, standpoint. In an inquiry-based model like the IB, I work with secondary students. Being multilingual opens up this world of opportunities. The nature of how schools, international schools around the world collaborate is changing. I think part of that is being facilitated by the networks being formed between international teachers. But if a student wants to collaborate with a peer on the other side of the world and do that in a language that is not the dominant language of the classroom, it's possible. And so just a couple examples. Last year in our DP Visual Arts exhibition, we had a student who spoke German, reached out to a school in Germany, was studying the Bauhaus movement and architecture as a way to sort of facilitate the visual arts exhibition that he was putting together, and was able to look at these primary sources in German and speak in German to kind of the experts who could help him facilitate his project in Costa Rica. So those sorts of simple collaborative opportunities, again, it opens up a whole lot of possibilities. I think it also connects with the ultimate mission of international schools of being part of a larger global community, right? Having the skills to reach across to other people living elsewhere enhances and contributes to that idea of intercultural understanding and respect.
Absolutely, yeah. Some fascinating points made there. And as you said, Adam, this is a sort of a bigger question, isn't it, about the identity of international schools in general, right? And the importance of including all languages is fundamental to a truly international education. Yeah. And so now sort of moving more on to sort of practical tips and strategies. each, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on what current best practice looks like when teaching multilingual or EAL learners, and maybe we can have a look at some of the less good practices or worst practices that you've come across as well. But maybe starting with best practice that each of you have maybe tried, implemented in your own classroom and found that have worked. Some of those strategies would be great to go into.
This is a short this is a sort of something you can use as a lesson primer. It's something I came up with spontaneously, and it was a happy sort of outcome. But basically, if there's a term, like for example, we use culture. So I came into class, it was a unit on cultural diversity. So I said to students, okay, you have 5 minutes, go around the class and collect as many different words for culture in as many different languages as you can. So I think we collected about 9. So it highlighted the fact that, in a group of 15, we had 9 different words for culture. And then we spoke a little bit about the roots of those words. Some of these languages had very literal translations for culture. So I remember, for example, this is just off the top of my head, for Hindi, it's Sanskriti, which means like culture is sort of synonymous with language, Sanskrit. With another language, culture literally translated into something like land of arts or something like that. So then that allowed us to piece together this understanding of like, okay, this is what culture is made up of, and this is how our many languages, at least the ones that we have here, perceive culture. So it was a fun primer, and I've used it for other words as well. But it's just a way to get students to think about, again, that question of how is my language shaped by, my culture essentially, and how is that in turn influencing my worldview. Yeah.
Fantastic, love that. Anyone else want to go next?
I can go. Yeah.
That's fine.
So thank you. So we're talking about practical tips and to support multilinguals, EAL learners, and so I actually recently wrote a little bit about this for SN, about how to support language learners, new students when they arrive in my class. So I teach world languages, and so how to support them. Especially when they are new to the school or new to the class, and so often those students are EAL students, English as an additional language learners, and so the first thing to me is attitude. The teacher's attitude is super important. Making the students feel welcome, telling them that this is a space where they are safe and comfortable, and they are supported. I think this is really, really important. I think that's the first point for me. The students who are in EL are mainly placed there because they need to increase their level of English and to have access to the curriculum. And so there could be sometimes elements of anxiety that we need to take into consideration, that we need to think about. Some of those students can also be the strongest students. So when they come to my language class, they've already gone through the process of acquiring English through this process, and they come to my French class, for example, my Spanish class, and then they're used to that process of acquiring another language. And some of the students become the strongest students. If they are academically strong, then they would be the strongest students in my class. Now, to be inclusive of those students, what we do here at my school, at the American School in Budapest, we use what we call a TPRS approach, a teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling. So it's the idea of using stories to support language learning. And that puts everyone at the same level. Whatever your language level is, this approach enables everyone to participate. They are like mini interactive sessions that I hold to make my students speak the language that I teach them. So that way, those multilinguals or those EL students gain confidence by they feel included, because they see that, no, English is not the main language here. It's a common language that everybody is learning at the same level. And so often I don't really understand why we deprive EAL students to access another language. Often those classes take place at the same time. And I till now, I've taught for more than 20 years. I don't understand why we deprive students. Like, I think it's Jacob who said earlier, now everyone has a right to learning either their own language or another language. And I totally agree with that. And then students sometimes are taken out of the word language class to learn English because they need to increase their level. And I feel that's kind of unfair for them. They should be able to access the other language that their peers are learning. And so these are just some ideas, some techniques that I used, and also I think the approach, the teacher's approach, and the care that the teacher takes towards those students is super important.
Just a quick point on that. How can the teachers care? How can that sort of be fostered, I suppose, and sort of looked after as, I suppose, the more experience the teacher gets, maybe the more responsibilities they have outside of the classroom? How is that sort of maintained? Because I suppose, yeah, like you said, that attitude is so important, isn't it?
If I don't mind, I can answer this question as well. Thank you, Max. That's a very important question because there are so many different ways one can care. And I think the first one is to get to know your student first, to get to know their background, their family background, their cultural background, where they come from, where did they travel from, what school did they come from, what is any learning needs they may have. Talking to their homeroom teacher is also important. Connecting with other subject teachers is another way that you can get to know the students. And then also, speaking to the student, just finding out and, not becoming friendly, but just getting to know the students in depth so that you really know the background, you know what issues, problems that they may be facing, especially if they are new students to the school. We don't know what baggage students come from. And these are different approaches that I would say would be useful to take to care for students.
Excellent. Thanks, Francois.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think from teaching English for 8 years, one of the things I used to see a lot was people overly correcting in the classroom as well. When somebody's trying, it could be a logical kind of translation that they're trying to do from their home language to English, and the teacher was correcting almost, every other sentence that they were saying. And it's knowing as the teacher, whether the focus is on fluency and accuracy in that language learning class. If they're communicating what they want to communicate, then that is fluent. If there's kind of like a writing assignment where you're practicing some grammar points, then yes, you will mark for accuracy. So I think just being very kind of conscious of that kind of negative washback effect that kind of being overly critical could be, older students will sometimes say, correct me, but it's getting that that balance, I think, in the classroom. Or when, then to go through errors, if you also don't want errors to get fossilized, so you can maybe design a lesson or something around that later, or give some recommended exercises to that student to do, for homework. I think you've got to be very conscious of that, and kind of concept checking as well, like asking students, do you understand? I used to hear teachers do this all the time, and students will always say yes. They don't want to say, no, I don't understand, in front of their peers. So just making sure that you kind of ask those kind of no questions, or questions where there's like a choice between two things, or, a fuller answer, just to make sure that you're supporting them and then not leaving them to it when they don't understand. So I think that's especially in mixed ability classes, you get that a lot, I think.
Yeah, excellent points. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Himani?
Yeah, and also I think communicating, having a relationship with the students wherein you communicate how you are thinking of supporting them, and then checking in to see whether they'd like that kind of support. So for example, a practice in some of my lessons is, if I know there's a learner, an EAL learner, I'll put subtitles in their native language. For smaller classes, or for a class in which the majority speak another native language. There was this one student who said, don't do it for me. because I'd like to actually challenge myself a little. Whereas other students say, actually, yes, I'd like if you put Korean subtitles for the second watch of this video, because it's enhancing my understanding. So having that communication with the students, because I know some students feel embarrassed by this public acknowledgement that they need support. Yeah.
It really touches on Francois's point about building that trust with students, right? So they feel comfortable about being honest and sort of coming to you with their suggestions and thoughts too. Yeah, excellent point. Jacob, yeah, what are your thoughts?
I think, yeah, I guess to zoom out a little bit before I zoom back into the practical, I think when we think about the best practice, let's start with the worst practice. And like I think the worst practice is that those that are still rooted in like deficit-based approaches that see multilingualism as a problem that we need to have interventions for. We need to pull kids out and try to fix them somehow before they can be part of the school. But so those are the worst approaches. Then better than that are those kind of asset-based approaches, the techniques that we've been seeing that tap into the students' strengths and see the power of multilingualism and see that if we can leverage this, we can achieve great things and we can use it as a resource. But then I think we need to take it one step further in terms of best practice and not just consider the students as individuals and their strengths, which is surely better than seeing just their weaknesses. But then to take it one step further, we need to look through an equity lens, and we need to be looking at the systems in which our individual students are entangled within our schools. And how can we, so when we look at it through that kind of lens, we're looking at what programs are we offering. We're looking at how the staffing is working within, like, for example, the EAL provision, the resources that we have. We're asking those kind of questions. And with the approach we've developed in our school, we said that our kind of best practice approach has three pillars. The first pillar is having a language friendly ethos. So we're part of this network of schools called Language Friendly Schools, and I would encourage anyone watching to follow that up. Their website is languagefriendlyschool.org. So we're part of that, and we're building this ethos of being a language-friendly school, language, linguistic and cultural inclusivity, welcoming all languages, dialects, and accents. So that's the first pillar, is that whole school ethos of inclusivity. And then the second pillar is individualized, personalized language pathways for students that allow them to develop their whole linguistic repertoire. And then the third pillar, the final pillar as we see it, is the shared responsibility of all teachers for the language development of their students. So that requires good professional development to ensure that the subject teachers, classroom teachers, are equipped to take on that responsibility in a meaningful way. So language friendly ethos, quality individualized language instruction in home language, as well as additional language, as well as the language of instruction in the school. And then the third pillar of shared responsibility amongst all members of the school community for language development. That's, I think, how we could summarize best practice in a kind of framework.
Fantastic, Jacob. Really, really interesting. Yeah. Any other final thoughts on best practice for multilingual EAL learners?
Yeah, I'll jump in with one idea. I'm sorry I left for a minute there with the power outage, but one thing that comes to mind with best practice for me is being aware of the language we as educators and as schools use when we talk about multilingualism and multilingual learners. Thinking about the gap between inclusive language policies and the school culture. So we still hear multilingual learners in their classes being referred to as English pullout or English extra, or we'll adopt the terminology of the diploma program of English B and bring it down to a primary school level, or they're the pullout students or the English extra students. We set a department goal around this last year, how we can talk about multilingual students in a more empowering way. So making sure that we're referring to them as they are, which is learners, and not sort of adopting this language that had been left over from again, this monolingual mindset of them being something something different, right? ESL students, English B students, English pull-out students. So I think that's one practical tip, is being conscious and aware of how it is we talk about multilingual learners and the effect and power that our words can have on those students.
Excellent point. Yeah. Anyone want to add their thoughts on that before we move on to the next question?
Maybe one last one.
Yeah, Francois, yeah.
Very, very simple way to show that we care is to run surveys. So run regular surveys and to get feedback from students on anything, really. It can be on, my teaching practice, or it can be on how they feel about the class, on how they would like to improve the class, on what they would like to learn in the class. It can be anything. And running, if you do those regularly, they don't take time. They're quick and easy to make, to build, and to get students to submit. And it's amazing. It's amazing to see the feedback that students give, and then modify the teaching practice, then my teaching practice, based on the feedback that I get from students. It really helps not only improve my own teaching practice, but also their learning experience. So I just want to share that.
That's amazing. Francois, just a quick question on that. How do you present that to students? Is that a sort of a virtual survey on an iPad, or is it a written form? How is that presented to your students?
Form, like a Google form. It's a link, they click on it, they put in their names, or it can be anonymous. Sometimes they'll be anonymous. Yeah. And so they just fill in. It takes 2 minutes at the beginning of class, the end of class, anytime. And again, if you're used to those Google Forms or whatever forms you decide to, whatever system you use, then they're easy to create. Sometimes I even create them with my students. So we make the form together. What would you like to ask the class? And they tell me, they put the questions together. So that becomes part of the class. No prep required for teachers. That's good. Love that.
Very, very cool. Great stuff. Any other final thoughts before we move on? All right. Great. So the next question, what techniques can teachers use to encourage students to use their first language in the classroom to support their learning? Again, a real focus on practical tips that you guys have used. Who'd like to start with that one? Jacob, go for it.
I would go further than encourage, and I think we need to be designing our the best way is to design our instruction to enable and require students to do this. So there's a number of, so that can happen on the task level or lesson level or unit level. So for example, within a unit of work, teachers can plan activities in which translanguaging and using different languages within the classroom is required as part of the learning, and that will really enrich the learning for all students. So let's imagine the teachers has a unit on a Shakespeare play, and they're going to look at how the kind of decisions about staging and costume might impact on the audience. Then why not view the same scene in multiple languages, right? We have global Shakespeare websites where you can see this, so we can watch the same clip in the languages represented in our classroom. And yes, some of the students may not understand what's being said, but they're going to be able to analyze the decisions made, and then the other students will be able to help them understand how the translation was done, etc. And then they can write a comparative essay comparing how the culture has influenced the ways in which the different language productions were put together. So that's an example of how a unit can be designed around translanguaging in an intentional way. And then within that can be done on the lesson level as well, or in the actual tasks. So designing routines in which so I have a routine, for example, we take think, pair, share. This is a common routine used in classrooms, but I've added another stage. So I have think, pair, prepare, share. And I would ask the students first think about their ideas, then they pair with a partner, a home language buddy, to talk about their ideas in the home language. And then in the prepare stage, they use their translations, etc. They use their devices to help them get ready to share that in English, and then they share that in English. So that's a routine that is not just encouraging them, it's saying that this is a time when you're going to use your home language to support you in your learning. And another example like that is I would often set homework tasks where students need to research something and maybe they need to speak to people to find out information. And then what I've started to do now is say, when you're researching this topic, you need to speak to people from at least 3 or 4 different languages. And that one can be your home language, one can be English. And then so you get the different cultural perspectives into the research. And if they can do that using different languages, great. If they can only speak English to some of those people as a shared language, that's fine, because you're still bringing the cultural, different cultural perspectives into the research. And that can lead to a more richer piece of work. So that's what I would say is intentionally build the translanguaging and the use of home language, other cultural perspectives into the units, the lessons and the tasks that we're setting.
Excellent. Yeah, fantastic. Francois, yes. Yeah.
I love your answer, Jacob. Thank you. The idea of translanguaging and also using input from different languages and different language backgrounds really helps. What I hear is that context is very important. The context of whatever we want the students to know and find out is very important. So I do the same. Like as I said earlier, I use storytelling, and when I read a story with my students, I always make sure that they understand the background of the story before we even start talking about it in the other language. That they understand it, whether it's in English or their native language. I want to then ask them questions about the story. So we will do that in English first. We'll make sure they understand the plot, the relationships between the characters and so on. So we explain some vocabulary as well that may be difficult for them. And then the students can then answer my questions in the target language better. So I would assume you would do the same thing. It's the same kind of ideas that Jacob was just talking about. But another point that I wanted to add is that, using the home language or the native language in class and how we can support that. First of all, I think that teachers need to make students understand that the use of the first language in class is acceptable and encouraged. I think that's the first point. And we must be explicit about the time when this is appropriate. I think this is the second point that is very important. For me, the first criteria for appropriate use of language is inclusion. We want everybody to feel included. So whenever we express ourselves in a group, our manner, our words indicate whether we include people, others or not. So we just have to observe people in social context, and you can see according to, there are signs in the mannerism, in the words they use, whether they're being inclusive or not. I'm sure we've all experienced that. Because the purpose of language in education is to let us access knowledge and interact to improve our understanding of things, concepts. And if the language is limited, that's our vocabulary, our ability to use vocabulary effectively, then our understanding can only be limited to. So we must allow our students to interact in their own language, and then they can access knowledge at a deeper level. And then we can also clarify any misunderstandings they may have. So then we can transfer that knowledge into English or whatever language, and that is whatever the language of instruction is. So again, we've got to keep all these things in mind to include the first language in our teaching.
Excellent, thanks, Francois. Any other final points on practical tips for encouraging first language use?
Yeah, one practical tip or idea, I guess, that I've had success with is building in service as action opportunities into the unit and lesson planning around first language. We have just a handful of Mandarin speakers at our school, but last year had a really successful lesson in which those Mandarin speakers visited other classrooms and taught students how to write their names in Chinese characters and just share their home language. in a way that isn't often allowing them this chance of leadership and showing a sense of community and belonging at the school.
That's really cool. I love that. Yes, Himani, yeah.
I'm so sorry, I have to jump off because I have a class right now.
Don't worry, don't worry. Great having you on the call, Himani.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This was incredible.
All right, great. Any other final thoughts on that before we move on to the penultimate question?
Just a bit similar to something Himani mentioned earlier about when she was translating, the word culture into our languages. Sometimes if I had a class with lots of different home languages in, if we'd been reading a story or something that's about emotions or feelings, if there was a word in their language that better described the word than the word in English, then I'd often ask them to kind of share that with the class and explain the meaning. And sometimes we'd build up like a bank of different words that then we could put in kind of like a class kind of resource and things that we wanted to use, not just feelings, but lots of other things. There's some words I haven't lived in China for 12 years, but there's still some Shanghainese words that I love to use because we don't have an equivalent in English. So I think that's just, again, it's just it helps that understanding culture. And, I think it makes people feel valued that they're sharing something of their language as well.
That's such a great point. I love that. Yeah. I mean, I suppose because there's so many loan words, aren't there, in English and other languages that we sort of borrow all the time in real life. So why shouldn't that be the same in the classroom, right? And like you said, some words do just, they capture an essence that maybe another language can't. So it's, I love that. Yeah, really, really cool. Great stuff. All right. Any other final thoughts before we move on? Okay. Great. So the next question, how important is diversity of language text when it comes to teaching English language and literature in an international school setting? Who'd like to get first on that?
I'll jump in first, and then I'm also going to have to head out. I have a commute to school this morning. But yeah, so for me, this is super important, right? In my English language and literature classes, both in the DP and the MYP, I think we know that the demographics of international schools have changed over the past 30 years. My school where I teach, it's 70% local students, Costa Rican students, 30% international. And still oftentimes that local culture isn't reflected, especially in the English language and literature curriculum. It can be tricky in a non-English speaking country. So, historically, the ways we do that is we find a Costa Rican writer and we look at a work in translation, right? Or we'll read something and then we'll take concepts and we'll contextualize them to the local context. One of the practices that I've really enjoyed doing is finding Costa Rican writers who are writing in English here in Costa Rica and looking at what they're writing and why they're writing in English. And the one that's most interesting for me, and I think for my students, is to look at songwriters and to look at music. And so I'll play a song in English for the students. We'll play the guessing game. Where's this band from? Eventually, they'll guess Costa Rica. And then first of all, we start sharing music, Costa Rican bands that are singing in English. But then we start looking at the lyrics. How is culture reflected? Oftentimes we'll see this in reggae music in the country, for example. And so we'll look at the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica and the influence of Jamaican migrant workers working on the railroads and the language and culture that was brought to Costa Rica then, and that sort of blending of cultures that still exists. But then we'll also ask the big question of why choose to write a song in English, right? Why does English sell? What's the power of language? What sorts of power do various languages hold? And then we start questioning ourselves, why are you learning English? What's the goal here? Why are you in this school as opposed to another school locally? So I think there's really some interesting works to be studied. But also, more importantly, I think interesting conversations around identity development and language and power, and we've had some real success with that. So I find that as a way that's fun and empowering to incorporate local voices into the curriculum. And I think it's really important because, you know, there's talk of this idea of fourth culture kids, right? Local students who are attending an international school, right? They're from the country in which the school is based, but they're not getting any local history, or that local culture isn't reflected in their schools. So any way that we can do that in the English language classroom in non-English speaking countries, I think is a worthwhile endeavor. I'm going to have to run. I'm going to commute to school. So thank you very much for the conversation this morning. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
All right.
Can I pick up on what Adam was saying?
Yeah.
So I think he's given a great practical example of what I was the point I was gonna make. So that's really helpful. Like, I think representation is very important. I think we don't want our students just to, you know, all their texts are providing the windows to other worlds, but not mirrors to reflect themselves back. So representation is absolutely necessary, but I don't think it's sufficient on its own. And that's, I think, the point that Adam's example was making, that we want our students to be reading texts that they can engage with in critical ways, and that to develop their critical literacy, but also to reflect in a self-critical way on their own experiences, and to think and reflect on their own experiences and identities. So that might mean in many schools, texts in which the writers or the main characters have hybrid identities, or have migrated from one place to another place, are experiencing discrimination. These kind of things allow our students to better understand the experiences that they're going through themselves in terms of their own cultural identity, their own like personal development and identity formation. So I think that's the representation within the literature in the classroom is the first step, but we need to take it further than that to develop that kind of critical literacy and allow the students to have that space to and develop the language with which they can reflect on their own experiences and identities.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jacob. Any other final thoughts?
Just again, from like an ELT perspective, with English language learners they're often given course books that are about like cheese rolling in Somerset or something like that, you know, and sometimes it's just knowing as well what's going to be useful and practical for your students as well, what they need to know, because that's going to help with the engagement as well. I think, like as kind of like Jacob was saying there, I think that yes, you need to learn about the world and other things, but you also need to learn how to communicate in English as the first priority sometimes as well. And some of the books kind of can lose sight of this. So I think sometimes being, you know, mindful of your choices and materials as well, I think is really important. And also if you're using like bilingual texts as well, ones that kind of put equal weighting on both languages, from kind of publishing perspective is something that we would try to do, because otherwise there is that othering, you know, that this is the most important language and this is the kind of one just to kind of help you having true kind of bilingualism, as we've been talking about earlier as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely.
And also, like, let's remember to honor the diversity within the languages as well, in terms of the different forms of language, different varieties. Like, so for me, as an English language acquisition teacher, I want my students to become familiar with global Englishes, not just American English, British English, etc. I want them to experiencing different forms of English, and also legitimize like Korean English as a form of English, or Chinese English as a form of English, English as an Asian language, as a lingua franca. These kind of ideas are very important for us to engage with. So the diversity within our languages as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on one word that Sarah used, engagement, I think is key. And another word that I want to bring up is empathy. If we bring in different cultural backgrounds and different texts from different backgrounds and cultures, then I think it would be our students would be open-minded. It would be open the minds of our students to not just the traditional texts, but others that could be undiscovered if they didn't have the opportunity to use and study those texts in school. Yeah.
Do each of you, Jacob, Francois, do you find that some of the textbooks that you're currently using in school are quite weighted towards a particular, just in English, and maybe doesn't integrate other languages as much as they should? Do you find that's a common issue with resources in EAL classrooms?
Yeah, and that's why I would prefer to, empower, ask the students to bring their own resources, find resources that are, interesting to students, that are relevant to their life experiences. Every class is so unique that if you're using a textbook, that's of course never going to be enough, that we would need to supplement that with texts and materials that are specific to our context and our students' needs.
That's interesting. It's in the world language class that I teach. We use, as I said, stories, and those are adapted stories. Either they are simplified and they are from famous authors, or they are simplified stories that people, new authors have written. And we use those, and those stories touch on different issues that concern the students, and they are adapted for the level, for the age. And the age and the maturity level of the students that we teach. So it can vary from something like, when for my younger learners, they're interested in their pets and their hobbies, or it can be something more complex, like identity and diversity and equity. If you teach high school students, those stories are adapted, and they include those topics that interest students, that are of concern to students. So that's also something that can be included.
Wonderful. Thanks, Francois. All right, fantastic. Now moving on to the last point for us to discuss. If there's any further support or provisions that could be introduced for multilingual students in an international school setting, is there any final thoughts on that? How further we should be going to providing support for multilingual learners in a practical sense? Any thoughts?
So I can say two things. The first one is very brief. I think, like, my advice or suggestion, teachers should try to learn some of the languages of their students. This is a great way to develop empathy, build a relationship with the students. Even just a few words or a few greetings in the students' languages can make a huge difference. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think, is about student voice, and a number of people have mentioned it earlier about surveys and these kind of things of our students, but building that student voice and student agency is of the multilingual learners, listening to their experiences, centering their voices, having things like we have developed a language and culture committee, and we have student leaders of that to look at these kind of issues and give them a voice. Developing leadership opportunities for students who may be underrepresented. For example, often students who are less proficient in English at the moment don't have the chance to go for leadership opportunities within schools because they're required to stand on stage and deliver speeches in English. Well, how can we find other opportunities to give those students leadership roles within the school, to build that student agency and empower the language learners in our school? So that's what I think is really important. Find ways of building student voice and agency for the EAL students or the multilingual learners.
Well, just one way that I was thinking of is, and then we heard it, I think, from Jacob earlier, about pairing students. So pairing students, native speakers with non-native speakers of English, especially because most of international schools use English as a medium of instruction. And so that creates, well, an obstacle to other students whose level of English may not be as proficient. So whenever there are activities, learning experiences in the classroom that may require more language, pairing students and building that empathy among students, especially the native speakers, and vice versa. and getting those students to learn how to collaborate and work together. I think those skills are not only important in the school context, they're important for life. So the life skills that we need to build in our students. And that's one way that I think we could support our multilingual students in our schools. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that sometimes I would allow a bit of time as well if there were some important notices at the end of a class, just sometimes to allow them to kind of translate into their home language the message, because it can often be the case that maybe they are the kind of most proficient English speaker in their family, and they have that kind of important role in their family to be that translator and that link between the school and their parents as well. So I think sometimes just allowing that little bit of time to make sure they've got down all the information that they need, because, you know, kids can forget things as well, or if they need to record it on their phone or something like that, to just allow them to do that as well, I think can help.
Wonderful, great stuff. Any final thoughts on that? Because I think, yeah, we are pretty much time up.
Yeah, maybe one, just one, Max. I think following on from what Sarah has just said, providing instructions in writing is very important as well. Some students are more visual, they need that support, and I know that I do. I need to see things in writing sometimes to understand what I hear, because I'm a non-native speaker myself. So I think it's a good way to support our students as well, just providing that. And it's easy now, you know, information can be shared online. Students may be absent, and that can be shared with them on the learning management system, which can be easily built, you know, within the school learning management system, and the students have access to that as well.
Excellent. All right, fantastic stuff. Thank you so much, guys. Just sort of looking forward. I think the whole conversation around learning the language of the home country of the school, where the school is located, is a fascinating topic. So I think it's probably what we'll look into maybe in a part 2. But yeah, for today, that's it. And yeah, brilliant stuff. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, and obviously to Himani and Adam as well. And yeah, great stuff. Thank you so much, guys, for your time.